This is the Alembic Files, and I'm Al.
And I'm Theo.
Don't sound so happy. What we're going to do today, and Theo will lead off with this, is to kind of direct our study toward the Constitution and the kind of information about the Constitution that we weren't taught in school. There's two things that you keep hearing people say, especially around the time of the presidential election, but the two things they get down to is, well, we have to vote in good government, and we have to get back to the Constitution. We must get back the Constitution. But what we're trying to say is, one, we barely ever had good government, if at all, and we never really had the Constitution to lose it to try to get it back. Theo's going to lead off with this, and we have a number of sources to also share with you, and we'll see how much time we have to get this done within an hour. If not, we'll just pick it up where we left off in part 4 of Once Upon a Time, the fairy tale about America. So go ahead, Theo.
Well, here's a quote from James Montgomery. I think this was, in addition to his two books, he has a series of answers to emails that he put up in text form on the Internet, and I think this came from that. So here's Montgomery, and this sums it up. Quote, "We are living an illusion of reality, supplied to us in contradiction to reality. We are taught that we have a constitutional republic, enumerated rights in the Bill of Rights, guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. If this was reality, our government would not be dysfunctional and in turmoil. This same illusion causes the turmoil in society. People are told they are free, but suffer under a yoke of oppression. They know there is a problem, but can't put their finger on the problem." And all right, unquote. And then Montgomery identifies the problem and all the rest. The problem is it was a big con job.
All right, I don't know how much you
say.
I'm sorry for stepping on you there. What I wanted to say is I'm unaware of how much information you have. I'll only say this to you. I have about a page and a half that at some point later on, I just want to make you aware of that I'd like to read. And that comes from the book, Sources of the Constitution of the United States, considered in relation to colonial and English history. It was written by C. Ellis Stevens in 1894. And I think you're familiar with that, are you not, Theo?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, and I think that's very important for that to be out there as well. I'll save it to the last if you're loaded with info to share. Also, we'll give the links to that particular book, which you can read online. I did have it once, which I got out of interlibrary loan, but it's all there to be read online. So anyway, let me throw it back to you. You know where you're going, and so with that proviso that I'd like to get that in there later on. Please go ahead.
Well, okay, so the 1787 Constitution was not what it was cracked up to be, and our so-called founding fathers were not who we thought they were. You know, they were a bunch of aristocrats, lawyers, and Freemasons and the like, who wrested control of the country in their hands, and they had more money and more slaves than other folks. So they protested enough against the taxation that was going on from Britain, and what they finally did win for themselves is they ended the taxation for themselves. You know, old school mercantilism like that, what it was is the mother country would set up a colony, and then they would forbid that colony from establishing any manufacturing base that would compete with the mother country in trade. And but they would just use that daughter country, the colony, as a market to sell the wares of the mother country. Of course, today we've figured out another way around that, but that's for some other show. So yeah, there was enough that these aristocrats, these founding fathers, they wanted to compete in manufacturing. So Gustavus Myers also covers that. The revolution was really largely about the growing manufacturing base in the colony. They were growing restless. At any rate, the 1787 Constitution, one very vital thing that did not happen was King George, when he was dictating the terms of the 1783 peace treaty, King George did not grant to the United States allodial title to the land. He only recognized the colonists' use of the land, and that's vital. That means, as Montgomery says, we still are a British colony. That never changed. Okay, so regardless of that, we did get, I suppose, a few rights and many privileges from that 1787 Constitution. As we covered last time, the so-called Reconstruction era ended all of that. It killed the 1787 Constitution, that contract. It ripped it up forever. The Reconstruction did, when it denied many of the states a right to a Republican government. When you do that, you rip up the contract and deny it to all the states. We've been under military rule since the Reconstruction. Now, what I think we're going to get into in this show is, moving forward in time, in 1917, an act was passed under Wilson's administration, the Emergency War Powers Act, and then in 1933, this is the biggie, that's when FDR was told by the international banksters to take that 1917 Emergency War Powers Act and add that the United States citizens were now enemies of the state. And James Montgomery covers this pretty exhaustively, I would say, the secret historical background. The banksters at first came to Herbert Hoover and said, "You're going to do this. You're going to pass this act, and we're going to do this and declare the people the enemies of the state here, so they're going to be on the hook for all of the debt, to tighten the screws on them." And Hoover wouldn't do it. He was a lame duck. He was on his way out. He said, basically, I'm not doing this. And so it came to FDR. Actually, FDR passed initially. FDR didn't want to do it, and then he tried having them have Hoover do it. Hoover said, no way. And so finally it came back to FDR, and he was entering the White House at that time, and he was forced to do that. The 1933, what was that law called? It was a tweakage of the 1917 War Powers Act, but I forget what the 33 Act was called. But that was just devastating, and we've been enemies of the state ever since.
All right, I'm going to throw this out there only because I don't know if I can remember either. Are we talking about trading with the enemy?
Yeah.
All right, because you had the Banking Act then also. They all were in concert to create this kind of situation, which I would say is clearly adversarial between the government and its citizenry.
Yeah, okay, it was the 1917 Trading with the Enemies Act.
Okay.
In 1933, they changed it, tweaked it, so that, hey, guess what? The U.S. people, they're the enemy. That's us now.
Yeah, it's like I had said before. You can't be too overtly that way, because obviously you're going to raise more than suspicions of the people. You'll raise their ire as well. But right now, I think what has happened, we've always had the two-party system. Okay, we understand that. But we're to a point now, and I have to confess that I was also bitten by this. If I voted, I was an independent. I never classified myself as a Republican or a Democrat or anything else, or a Libertarian, none of that. But it was in the old days, if I voted Democratic and a Republican did something that I thought was horrible, I'd bang on the Republican, whoever that should be, whatever president that might have been at the time. Now, if something that I didn't really understand that I thought was questionable that a Democrat put through, I would try to make some kind of justification or rationale for it.
Oh, sure.
And that's what goes on today. People understand that government is not responsive and something is quite wrong with it. But also at the same time, as we stated before, the acrimony between Republican and Democrat supporters is the worst it's ever been, so much so that it's pure hatred, and that one votes not for their own person, but against the other party's person. That keeps people from understanding that no matter what party reigns, everything is going along a singular path to a definite end. And they can't get that because they're so blinded by hatred for the other party. And, of course, a lot of talk shows out there are there solely to keep stoking that. I mean, there are times when I'll pass through Rush Limbaugh's show or something and hear something, and I might be, I don't know, in a supermarket or waiting online someplace, and I'll hear someone in discussion with someone else parroting that same stuff. And I might just shake my head because the people are so propagandized and they don't even realize it. So going back to what you were saying, and I'll throw it back to you, there has been an adversarial nature, and I think it's actually becoming more evident. But at the same time, people are more blinded. So it's just kind of like in the same proportions. And the truth of the matter is it's finally going to come out. But by the time the whole trap is sprung, people will not have had a chance. So let me throw it back to you. I mean, there's other stuff I'm thinking about, but let's get back to the trail. Please pick it up, Theo.
Well, let's get this on record if people want to go look this up. And that's one thing, if you don't want to just have a purely emotional reaction, what you want to do is you want to do your homework. If this sounds completely radical and crazy to you, don't do the knee-jerk, purely emotional thing. Go and check it out first. See if we're crazy. You're going to be surprised by what you find, more than surprised. Okay, let's document this. The books you want to check out. Okay, the stuff that I just mentioned regarding the 1933 act where FDR and the banksters made you and me the enemies of the people, that is the focus of the James Montgomery book, A Nation Defeated in Victory. That's where Montgomery goes into that. Now, the other stuff, the Revolutionary War era stuff, is mostly covered in his other book, The United States is Still a British Colony. Now, some of that subject matter does overlap, but just so you know, those are the two you want to look up depending on what you want to focus on. And you know, traditionally and historically, when you're telling something, when you're reporting something, you want to have two witnesses. Well, as you know, there is another witness to this, and that's the informer. You can check out his stuff as well, and a lot of that is online, or you can buy his books, or at least you could until recently. I don't know what the status of that is.
All right, they're still there. Again, they can be purchased through the website thinkorbeeaten.com. Because one has to pay for the books either by money order or, I mean, you just can't do it online, folks. But you can go through that thinkorbeeaten.com and find out how to do it. It's going to be between you and the author, and it's going to be done by mail.
Maybe you can help me on this one. I actually am reading right now the essay you sent me by the informer that deals with what happened in 1933 and what they did, perverting that 1917 Act, the War Powers problem. But I'm about two-thirds of the way through it, maybe one half. But Al, are you able to elaborate on what that changes for us when we the people, the little people, are declared the enemy of the state? What does that do to us? How does that change our status? What can we not do? What does that mean? They can throw us in jail without habeas corpus if they want to? It's a privilege anyway. What does that change for us?
I don't know that it doesn't change everything. It just, I think, entrenches even more the idea that one has a persona as an employee or a slave of the incorporation known as the United States of America. When you play into that, obviously, you have no rights. And the reason I won't want to get too deep into this is because this is where we go back to Roman law, the idea of a person and such, and that is something that has to be really laid out over a period of time. And I had done that with the informer. I don't know how many shows we did. But it just entrenches what I would say is the idea of not being someone endowed with godly rights, if you will, and being really a subject of the government. As you had said, we have no rights. We only have privileges. And that's something that isn't very well known. And yet I found it interesting. When the informant and I were talking about this, it might have been 2 or 3 days later, and this is while Shrub Bush was still in office, when on C-SPAN I just happened to be passing through the channels, and at that time, Gonzalez was the Attorney General. And he said he was answering a question after he had given a speech, so you don't really hear the question that well because the mics aren't out in the audience. But what he said was, in response, he says, no, you do not have any rights, only privileges. And I near about fell off the chair because here it is said out loud. But people don't hear that. They hear it, but they just make some kind of construct where it somehow would make sense, or maybe you didn't really mean that. But that's what's said, and it happens all the time. And I know this is convoluted and where I'm going with this, but clearly it did put us at odds. I don't want to say forevermore because it's been like that to a certain extent. But remember also that when they had the Banking Act, that was a great theft, probably the largest theft of real money there ever was. You know what I'm saying? Well, with the banking holiday, and they told people they didn't want them transacting with gold and silver, so why don't you all turn it in, and we'll give you this fiat currency for it.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the largest theft in America, and it was perpetrated by the government. That's bigger than the Lufthansa robbery from, where was it, LaGuardia, by the Mafia? Or Kennedy, rather. But, so I'm dancing around this a little bit. But for me, what that does is say, forever we will be separate from the government, and we will be seen in an adversarial status. And as I said before, it's like it's an abusive parent. I mean, the government will actually create a situation. A lot of times they're referred to as false flag events, and freak out the people, get them all, worked up, maybe even kill some, and then they'll turn around and provide a solution for it, and everybody hugs the government for stepping in and becoming their protector. So I'll just leave it at that. Continue where you want to with that, because it's been quite some time since I read that particular article. I do believe that that's on thinkerbeat.com as well. I'll take a look, and if not, what I'll do is I'll leave that also available for folks to read. But go ahead. And I'm sorry, Theo, that I took so much time.
That what you just described, the government, in essence, beating the hell out of you and then offering to be your buddy, to be your protector. I mean, that's a protection racket, isn't it?
That's exactly.
And that's on another level, that is the process you see in interrogation rooms and torture dungeons. Remember the last part of the book 1984, where that was how O'Brien dealt with Winston Smith. One day he'd be torturing him, and the next day he would be his protector. Some very bad people have figured out that that's what really messes people up, destabilizes the human psyche enough to where you become so confused and you just give in to them.
Well, that's what's happened with the events that have occurred, especially, I would say, because of and since 9/11. I think we've also seen it with the frequency of shootings. People are freaked out. They want somebody to do something, and they'll pass a draconian law that in the end will probably work against them. So you're right. I mean, it's a situation where, they'll provide the problem and they'll provide the solution. And this has been going on for some time, but especially since, I would say, post-World War II, when boogeymen had to be created to keep that fear going. And one more example, okay, just to give you what we're talking about with regard to the government being an abusive parent. We're not going to explain here about 9/11 and how that was allowed, because that was allowed, the Pearl Harbor was allowed, the Lusitania sinking was allowed, and the USS Maine sinking was allowed, where citizens...
Well, more than just allowed, some of those were provoked, and some of those were even beyond that.
Oh, I'm just being nice by just saying it that way. Yeah. No problem. Yeah, absolutely. But what makes me laugh is when the justification for going into Afghanistan, just a little less than a month after 9/11, the whole mantra was, we're safer here because we're fighting over there. And yet, how many times in the last 10 to 12 years haven't we been told that we've just narrowly missed another terror event, and that these factions are still alive and working within this country. And so what I'm saying to myself is, okay, we're supposed to be safer here, but apparently we're not. True, nothing else has really happened, but what we're being told is it was going to, but we nipped it in the nick of time. So my thinking is, well, the problem is inside this country, not over in Afghanistan. It's got to do with immigration and some other things. So how are we safer here? Because we're fighting over there. And somehow that gets all forgotten about. People don't connect the two. They just want to be protected every time another terror event is a supposed terror event is thwarted. And we're left with all the measures that are put in there, even though the event never happened. And the greatest example of that is at the airport. All that's being done to stop potential terrorists. You could say, well, we never did have another event. Oh, that is true. But they never said that one was really even thwarted in a sense, but we still have to go through the whole yada yada to get on the plane. So, again, I've gone too far with that. But that's what I'm saying. People don't connect the fact that we are not safer here, but fighting over there.
As you know, and as we've talked about, one of the reasons why they are making airport or airline travel so uncomfortable is the same reason why gas prices are so high, and that is when a state, when a nation descends into fascism or communism or any totalitarian state, as the United States now is, then the rulers, the real rulers, they always seek to control your movement. They don't like people moving around.
Well, one of the earmarks of totalitarian government is limited or no travel.
Yes.
So it's easy to see, and this will happen over time, that, I think it's funny that in the 21st century, air travel is worse than it was in the 50s. Secondly, forget about Amtrak. A lot of developed countries have light rail or whatever and high-speed rail, and it works just fine. Here we got Amtrak, another example of what happens when the government gets involved in commercial enterprises,
yes.
and it sucks. And what's worse than Amtrak? Greyhound. So you've got three forms of travel that are really getting to become more odious, except the last two have always been bad. But air travel's got to a point where a lot of people are saying, forget it. And the other thing is, okay, then what do you resort to? The use of your vehicle. Well, what's going to happen there? Gas prices are going to go through the ceiling. Yep. So the idea is stay put, and I'll definitely raise my hand and admit that I'm a casualty, if you will, of that situation because they've made it that unpleasant. I don't care to travel anymore. I really don't want to fly where it used to be great. Now it's like, and I guess that's one of the problems too. I have something to compare it to at a time when it was kind of nice.
The problem is, a big problem is that the Americans who would classify themselves as patriots, they too see these modern problems that you and I see, but they think that if we can just take our country back and bring back our Constitution, that things are going to be okay. And that's what this show is really about, is we're trying to tell them, no, it's really not going to be okay. We the little people never had any country, and the only reason we were left alone more in the past was because there was more space and there was less surveillance, and it was more to do with geography than anything else. The Constitution never protected anybody, and it certainly never gave you title to your land.
Well, that's the other illusion that you had opened up talking about, and that is you really don't own anything.
No.
You can pay off the mortgage, but you still have property taxes. Get behind in that, and you're going to lose your land. So you never really own anything. You have the color of ownership, but in the end, it can be taken from you. And even if you're doing everything you're supposed to, let's say you paid off the mortgage on your house, and you're paying off the property taxes. No matter how high they get, you're okay there. But if you can turn around and have eminent domain come through, then bang, it's gone. You're finished.
Yeah.
And we've seen enough cases of that before to not even have to establish that fact. So you really don't own anything. You just think you do. And one other word, that going back to your original question about what did the war powers do, and I may look up while we're talking. If not, what I found interesting is this. If you remember last year, probably earlier in 2012 than later, Boehner was banging on the president for, I guess, it's not instituting, but applying the war powers. You remember that at all?
You had told me that. I remember that.
I'll go try to find it, but anybody can do a search and probably come up with that. And again, here I thought this was rich. Now, the critics of Obama would say, "Oh, he's created war powers, or he's instituting them," as if that was his own decision.
If they only knew.
That's right. I mean, they've been there forever. And Boehner, I think, brought it up as a criticism, of course, to agitate between Republicans and Democrats. And yet they've been there forever. And I said to I-Man, too, is that one of the reasons why we've never declared war since what? December 8th, 1941. We're always at war. And the war powers, emergency war powers, is something that circumvents the Constitution. So there you go. Like executive orders, that allows the president to act in a manner such as a dictator. And it's happened before and will happen again. So, yes, that happened. Now, also, I guess to sum up one thing, and that is this. As it was with the creation of the Constitution, also having Congress more or less make us the enemies enslaved us so that we would be, without knowing it, more responsive to placating, shall we say, global money and the international bankers. If you remember, the Constitution was struck by the founders to cover their rear ends so they'd be at peace with the Crown, who obviously told them that if we don't get our return on our investment, we'll come over there, throw a real war, and we'll also blockade you, and you'll understand what it's like to be in servitude again.
Well, that's what the War of 1812 was about, when the bank charter, the National Bank Charter, ran out in 1811.
Okay, so
that was one reason. The other reason is the original 13th Amendment, which is an episode of history, again, right out of a Twilight Zone episode. I'm looking at a quote from Montgomery about that right now. You know, how many members in Congress today are lawyers? A majority? Almost all of them? There was an original 13th Amendment, which the archives of that were destroyed in the War of 1812.
Well,
almost.
We've gone into that.
Yeah.
I think we went into that last time.
You could not be a lawyer and be a part of the government today if there was still that original 13th Amendment.
Quote also from that informer piece. He stated, President Lincoln then made us the enemy of the government by 12 Stat 319 in 1862. And I believe I have these documents as well that we could put up. Let's see. And Congress continued to keep the status quo by the creation of the Reconstruction Acts in 1867. Then in 1868, the 14th Amendment placed the people of both the North and South under the control of the military rule. That's why we were saying the Reconstruction Acts, where the Northern states didn't realize it, but they were hit with that as well. And we've been in that situation ever since. And the last sentence is the other banking system, after gaining a foothold in 1913, referring to the creation of the Federal Reserve, caused the demise of the independent Treasury. To complete the enemy status, Roosevelt finalized us as the enemies of the bank in 48 Stat 1, March 9th, 1933. Stat is short for statute. So that brings us full circle back to what you were talking about. Go ahead.
Well, do you recall in that informer essay you sent me, there one pivotal historical figure that the informer keeps hearkening back to, his name was Whiting?
Yes.
And he was a secretary. Lincoln was so impressed with his legal shenanigans. Lincoln made him what was the title? Secretary of War Powers, something like that. And Whiting was basically used as he helped Lincoln to justify anything, any takeover of power on behalf of the federal government over states' rights and individual rights. That, again, that Whiting guy is a shadowy figure in history. I had never heard of him before. Obviously, he played a central role in the Lincoln administration.
Well, I mean, it's amazing because what about 60 years later, you had another shadowy character that nobody really knows about and was pivotal in forcing through, without ratification, the income tax amendment.
And that's also where, right around the time you got the Federal Reserve Act and that 1917 Trading with the Enemies Act.
Well, the
and you're talking about, is that not House? No, Hopkins or House?
No,
House.
No, I'm thinking, well, we got a couple of things going on here. No, I'm thinking about Philander Knox.
Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, wow, yeah.
He was Secretary of State under Taft, and he kind of bridged the administration.
Under Teddy Roosevelt.
And Roosevelt, but...
Oh, both of them, okay.
Yeah, well, I don't think he served, I'll have to look, I don't think he served under Roosevelt, but at the time he was critical because he rammed through the amendment for the creation of the income tax, which they had to have because first you made the beast, which is the Federal Reserve, now you got to feed it. So he was in that critical time around 1913, but all right, now I remember too. Knox didn't serve under Roosevelt, but Knox was serving as a legal counsel to the robber barons. So here you have Teddy Roosevelt shaking his fist, talking about walk softly, carry a big stick, doing all this kind of supposed antitrust busting, right?
Now you're going back to like the 1900 era.
That's right, but that's when Knox, in a way, was working in concert, but he was working on the side of the robber barons.
He was a powerful corporation lawyer.
Yes, and he had started off under McKinley, under McKinley's law firm, and then he grew in stature. This all took place in Ohio, which is also where John D. Rockefeller started that whole thing. So that while Roosevelt is acting like a trust buster, Knox is taking care of the situation for the robber barons, who, in a sense, didn't mind this because they had already gained their fortunes through the monopoly. So all this really did was, this trust busting, was stop anybody from coming in after him and creating competition. So that's where Knox cut his teeth, and then later on, he strikes the American people again because he passed through. Now, when you say ran through, he just proclaimed that it was done. They just went ahead and did it. So that the income tax amendment was never really ratified.
Well, that's the same way they pulled off the Reconstruction Act. And including the 14th Amendment. That is the same way.
So that's where I was going with Philander Knox. But also, you went back and traced this as well. And when we talk about shadowy characters besides Whiting, I mean, there you have Philander Knox, who a great first name too, Philander. That's a clue.
Oh, yeah, how apt.
So, but you also had the war hero Sherman's brother, John, also being a snake in the grass. Becoming instructed on how to create what was it that he had going with the bankers? Oh, the creation of the Federal Reserve System, right?
That's right, and this also is covered in the book by James Montgomery, A Country Defeated in Victory. I think I said nation earlier. It's A Country Defeated in Victory by James Montgomery. Here, he also covers that known history with I think it was John Sherman. And he was a representative from Ohio. He was William Tecumseh Sherman's brother.
Right.
And Montgomery features a personal letter from one of the Rothschilds in answer to a letter that John Sherman had told him, had sent to him. The Rothschilds were, I think the Rothschilds were writing to another banker in Europe, and they were telling them that this representative in the United States, John Sherman, had invited the Rothschilds in to get a piece of the pie on this coming really swindle, this financial swindle that was about to happen in the United States. It was eventually going to become the Federal Reserve, and you had John Sherman inviting the bankers in on that. So obviously John Sherman was not on the side of his constituency. And another thing you have with that, and you have talked about this before, is William T. Sherman, the famous general. His hands aren't entirely clean either. He obviously had some inside information, just like his brother, because after that Civil War between the states, didn't Tecumseh Sherman go out and just happen to buy a bunch of real estate where the railroad was going to be laid down a little bit later, so that that land was going to be worth a lot more?
Yeah, when he was going out and making the world safe from Native Americans, while he was out there, he also bought up land that the railroad would pass through, and he made a killing that way as well as the other way.
So you got these guys with inside connections. I talked about last week how in the formation of Washington, D.C., George Washington and just a few other cronies had inside information. And they knew beforehand that D.C. was going to be declared the capital, so they did the same thing. Previously in history, they bought up that land knowing it was going to be worth a lot more later. How is that representing your constituency, being a friend to we the little people?
And by the way, let me throw this back at you just to complete this. Philander Knox was an Attorney General of the United States with McKinley. So he did serve under McKinley. So he was actually protégé by McKinley during his lawyering days. And, of course, now we see here that he was Attorney General there. He resigned, in June of 1904. And then he did serve from 1904 to 1909 as Taft's Secretary of State. Let me check that. He was Secretary of State under Taft from 1909 to 1913.
Okay.
The resigning was something else, and this is a bio I'm just drawing from right away because I just want to clear my head, which is very hard to do. But I didn't think he had any office under McKinley, but he certainly did, and he did under Taft, and he did under Roosevelt as well. But under Teddy, I believe he was Attorney General, and that's where the resigning comes from. He was Attorney General from 01 through 04. So there you have it. You know,
what a bunch of dastardly deeds that guy perpetrated.
Well, I mean, here again, the government gets fat off making deals with those who are the financial elite. But I would think it's correct to say that once the robber barons gained their untold millions, they proceeded to buy influence until they actually bought the people themselves, the senators and congressmen. And from that point on, they've been running the show, very content to stay in the shadows and not be connected to anything. But after they gained power, you could see through the 20th century, things did not improve necessarily for Americans.
What you just described, how the rich people get rich and then they buy the American government, that is factually documented exhaustively in the book The History of the Supreme Court of the United States by Gustavus Myers, and another book of more recent vintage but still just as out of print that does that is The Rich and the Super Rich by Ferdinand Lundberg.
Right.
Isn't it interesting that these books which document the truth about our history are all out of print? It's rather coincidental.
Well, it's also because they would not be picked up by major publishing houses. That's why.
And why would that be?
Of course. And as I had said, we had mentioned before, the character who owned the, I got to stop referring to him. It's something other than his name. He's now passed on. But he took a risk by publishing those books. And another publisher that put out stuff that was not popular was Devon Adair. D-E-V-O-N, Devon Adair, and they're the ones that published the book by Rear Admiral Theobald, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor. So there were titles out there that did that. Some of them escape me right now, but they were never the real big ones, that you would see in the front of where there used to be bookstores. So.
You know what I really appreciated about that book by Admiral Theobald? There are you know this, but there are 3 books that I know of that document the fact, the undeniable fact that FDR and his cabinet and General Marshall knew that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor, and they knew days, if not weeks beforehand, and they could have warned the Hawaiian commanders, but they did not want to do that. We know that. And it goes beyond that. We provoked them, really. So, but anyway, these three books, one of them is called Infamy by John Toland, a very respected World War II historian. The other is, the most recent one is Day of Deceit by Robert Stinnett. But that one in the 1950s, that's totally out of print, is the Rear Admiral Theobald's book. Remind me of the title of it?
The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor.
The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor. What I like about Theobald's is that guy, he starts the book smoking angry at FDR, and he ends the book just as smoking angry at what they did to those men who died that day. Whereas both Toland and Stinnett, at the end of their book, they throw in this weird, incongruous couple of paragraphs where they try to kind of justify what FDR and his cronies did in a way. They say, well, we had to get into the war anyway, and FDR and his boys, they didn't expect such a large loss of life at Pearl Harbor, but they knew that there had to be some loss of life. You never got that from Theobald. Theobald he just said this was wrong, and it was wrong, and should never have taken place.
I just went to Amazon to take a look. Believe it or not, they're offering the hardcover of Final Secret of Pearl Harbor for $21.
Is that a used one?
That's on the collectible. The used one, they said $1.
Oh.
Really? And $3.99 shipping. That's okay. No,
but it's not being printed anymore.
No. And I didn't mean to say that it was out there being published again. No, but it can be accessed, and I think anybody who's that interested, you will not be disappointed by that book. And what's even further interesting about what Theobald shares, because it was laughable. I mean, what he said is that the cabinet got together with Roosevelt, and that's that famous line I can't forget, is that when they knew they were going to let Pearl Harbor sucker them, the Japs sucker. That's politically incorrect, or socially, isn't it? It's the Japanese. When the Japanese were going to sucker the United States supposedly at Pearl Harbor, the cabinet agreed that they appreciated there would be a substantial loss of life.
Yeah, they appreciated it.
Now, the other thing about that is that Tom Dewey, who was going to run against Roosevelt in 1944, because he had made his bones by being a big I would say mob killer, but that's a bad choice of words. He was very effective in defanging the mafia, and on that he was going to run in 1944. He also was aware, this is the biggest secret that was never kept. He was aware that Roosevelt and the cabinet had foreknowledge, and he was going to use it running against Roosevelt. And he was told by his own party, by the Democrats, and by the Joint Chiefs of Staff that he said anything about that he would be indicted for sedition. So he lost in 1944, and I assume his sins were that great that even though he won in 1948, he lost in 1948 against Truman.
That's right.
Right. So Dewey made the mistake of sharing the secrets was going to share the secrets with the people, and that was not going to happen. And Stinnett's book, I think, is interesting because he has images of transmissions that were going back and forth between the Germans and the Japanese, and it was kind of like, in a sense, ironically funny that the Japanese sent a dispatch to the Germans in May of 1941 saying, I think America, the United States, has broken our code. And, of course,
That's
they
right.
had. So the United States knew exactly what was going to happen. And also the Japanese fleet, contrary to public consumption, what they have been told is that the Japanese did not maintain radio silence coming across the Pacific. And there were Dutch and British listening stations on islands strewed across the Pacific that knew they were coming.
Yeah.
It was laughable.
Stinnett, he covers
a few things that aren't covered in Theobald's book and Toland's book. One that stuck out with me was, okay, all those books discuss how the United States had broken the Japanese code. Stinnett has some new corroborating evidence for that. But and all those books also, of course, document the common knowledge that FDR put a trade embargo on Japan, a provocative trade embargo, especially oil, and also that we had frozen their assets, their monetary assets, another provocative move. But Stinnett documents something else that was previously hidden, was suppressed history here, that FDR had implemented this plan where for a period of time the U.S. was sending their fastest ship, some kind of cruiser. They would send a sole cruiser on the secret mission deep into Japanese waters, and they called them pop-up missions or something like that, where the American cruiser would just show up in an obvious act of provocation deep into Japanese waters, and then once they were sighted, the American cruiser would beat the hell out of there, would get out of there. But they did that several times. That, again, was to provoke the Japanese.
Well, it gets even better. And then we better get back to close out with the Constitution. But in the book, The Suppressed Truth About the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln by Burke McCarty, which was published somewhere in the late 20s, in that book, McCarty wrote that at the present, doing a bit of dealing with the present before she got into the past, that at the present time that the Jesuits were in Japan to instigate anti-American sentiment for a future war. Now, she wrote that in the 20s. And, of course, Billy Mitchell ran his mouth. He knew that we were going to fight the Japanese sooner or later. He ran his mouth and got court-martialed for it. Well, again, that was a kangaroo thing. But so, yeah. I mean, it was laughable that this was going to happen. And, of course, how many servicemen and women were ambushed in that situation? In fact, they had a sortie that was out just on a regular mission. Actually, the United States actually were landing while the Japanese were attacking. And they're coming down the middle of this like, what is going on here? So, we don't mean to make light of it, but, I mean, that's how pathetically tragic this whole thing is. And, again, this is what we're referring to as the government creating a terror event for a purpose, which is usually get everybody pissed off to go off and want to kick somebody in the butt, was what we saw happen in October of 2001, and we're not back yet. So, well,
this, I think, will kind of bring it back around.
Okay.
And that is, FDR and Churchill were working hand in hand. Churchill knew damn well that FDR was going to get this country into war on behalf of Britain. And there was, remember that one, I think he was an American soldier named Tyler Kent over in England. He found out about that, and he tried warning his superiors, and he was thrown in jail. They shut his mouth. But like you say, the metaphor of Master Blaster from that movie Thunderdome, the United States was set up by Great Britain to be the hitman, the thumb man, the thug, and it really took fruition later on in the 20th century. But really that was the design all along. We never were really cut loose. And as James Montgomery says, we're still a British colony. We just were given this delusion that we were independent.
Remember something, too, and that is the American people were not too cool about going to war in World War I. And even though Lusitania happened years before our entry, it still was a very sore subject and worked its...
Churchill played an integral role in that scam.
Yeah. Yes, and so did Wilson. But in World War II, America still was not kind of keen on going over. But what happened was, with the declaration of war against the Japanese, what that did was there was a tripartite agreement between Japan, Germany, and Italy that an attack on one was an attack on the other. So when we declared war against Japan, we automatically had war with Germany and Italy. And then Germany acted in the manner that it had to keep the tripartite agreement, vital. So, in a sense, then, the declaration of war on the Japanese was a backdoor way of now having war with Germany.
Well, sure, why not? Wall Street had financed Hitler's regime in Germany, so now the banksters that did that on both sides of the world, they could profit from this war, because, of course, they're going to loan money to both sides and get the usury from both sides.
Well, all right. We keep saying we're going to get back to the Constitution, but then we're also thinking about who backed the Bolsheviks, which is funny. The supposedly anti-capitalist communists were set up by Western bank money and implements as well. And, of course, as soon as it was clear that the Bolsheviks would wrest control for good from the Mensheviks and the Tsars, immediately there was a humanitarian legation sent over to Russia, some humanitarian group. I mean, I think one guy, there were like a couple of doctors, the rest were all heads of industrial companies in the West, to include International Harvester. And folks, also, if you want to check out a good source on what was going on with, as Theo just mentioned, Wall Street's involvement in wars and with our supposed enemies.
Anthony Sutton?
There you go. Anthony C. Sutton has a number of books out there dealing with this subject. Most of them are online.
Well, the two that would be most relevant there, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yes, when last I looked, it was also one, Wall Street. What did you just say the first title?
Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler.
Okay. There's also Wall Street and something with FDR.
Yeah, there's another one on FDR. Yeah.
That one was not online when I last looked. It hasn't been for some time, but you can get that in a library. So, good luck, because it's Sutton's book. But anyway, I did want to mention that. Also, I tell you what, we're coming up to the end of this, so we're going to bring it to a halt. The bit about Stephen's book that's online that I would like to deal with, maybe we can open with this the next time around. But I also want to let people know that there are other critics throughout the years, throughout the last several decades, that have not been happy with the Constitution, and that would include Lysander Spooner, who has written The Constitution of No Authority. Let me just take a look at that real quick.
Yeah, his was a real voice in the wilderness. He dates back to the 1800s.
Yeah, I had one site bookmarked that has now been suspended, but he pops up in another place at least once. I haven't taken a look if there are others. And again, we'll put those links up. But he has written, The Constitution of No Authority, which I believe is a segment of a book called No Treason. That's Lysander Spooner. Also, we have Albert Nock, another non-household name, who wrote Our Enemy, the State. And that was back, I guess, somewhere in the early part of the 1935. That's when it came out. So those are other people with discussions and arguments that weigh against the validity of the Constitution and its application as well. And as I had mentioned before, Toward an American Revolution can be read online also by Jerry Frisia, who I have said is a Marxist and states such. And, of course, that's a problem, too. But his criticism of the Constitution and his support for those criticisms are valid, and they should be looked into as well. So how about we call it a day? We'll come back with part 4, and we'll go back and take a look at the Constitution. Theo, I'll give you parting shots before we close up.
Yeah, the one so-called founding father that had some kind of merit, obviously, was Patrick Henry, and he took one look at this monstrosity called the Constitution that they came up with, and he said, amongst other things, he said it squints towards monarchy.
Right.
He did not like it. And yet, he went ahead and signed it anyway. Why did he do that? He was a lawyer.
That's what I may have said. Above all things, he was a lawyer. He was in the Brotherhood. All right, that'll wrap it up for now. Back with part 4 with Once Upon a Time.